Good morning, everybody. You know, after last night's film, I felt profoundly moved. And I was in Israel 2 years ago doing training on strategic nonviolence, and I heard Ayed speaking about what was happening in Budrus. And in acknowledgement of your struggles, I thought I'll do a bit of ambush marketing here. And you may not feel it's appropriate in an academic institution, so I'll put on my activist hat and speak from my own experience as an activist. And just to say that we have a very strong and close relationship with the Palestinian resistance in South Africa, and I consider myself now to be an activist within the Palestine Solidarity movement. And we're going to be talking this morning about movements, so I hope we can unpack some of these things later on in the day. The other thing that I have to warn you about is that South Africa and my national team, Bafana, are at the moment, as we speak, playing France. And this is their very last chance to stay in the World Cup. And if France, you know, the French team has been having a bit of a civil resistance, and the players have been refusing to practice. So they might just collapse and we may score 7 goals, in which case we'll proceed to the next round. So I'm relying on my comrades in the audience who are online to shout La Duma if there is a goal. So if you hear La Duma, then you know that Bafana has scored a goal. Okay. Okay, so in the middle of the session, don't be surprised if you hear this. This is of great importance to me. The other thing I thought I should let you know, which is an interesting thing, if you look on the website, I'm sure you'll find it in the Palestine Solidarity Movement website. We are having a campaign at the moment around the World Cup to hold up posters saying "Red Card Israel" because of what happened in Gaza. So we keep your eyes open. You might see these cards. We try to get them into the international media. Okay, you know, that film last night was so powerful, and I know that Hitam is working in a consumer boycott campaign at the moment. The version or the episode of A Force More Powerful that deals with South Africa looks at a consumer boycott. Let me just get an indication of how many of you have watched that. That's great, that's wonderful, because I'd rather use this time to interact with you rather than show the film. But films are very, very powerful in conveying what that movement was like. So if you've seen the film and you've seen the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people engaged in that form of resistance in South Africa in 1985, you'll have an impression of what that movement involved. But what I've got to tell you about that film is that that film is about the consumer boycott in Port Elizabeth in 1985. That was one campaign in one city in a national movement which lasted for many years and involved many campaigns in many cities all over South Africa. So you've got to see it in the same way as you saw that film last night about Budrus. Budrus is one village in the West Bank where there was one campaign that ran over a couple of years. And, well, how long did it last? 10 months. 10 months. And that campaign is part of a movement, a resistance movement within the West Bank, which has been running over many decades, in fact. The South African struggle also ran over many decades, but there were different periods in which that movement gained momentum as a movement and engaged in a sustained struggle. So let me get the PowerPoint up, and I'm going to focus on the United Democratic Front, and this is the time period in which the UDF operates. Are you all familiar with the UDF? It is mentioned in the A Force More Powerful video, and the organizations that were running the Port Elizabeth consumer boycott were affiliates of the UDF, of the United Democratic Front. And this organization lasted for a very specific time period from 1983 to 1989. So what is a movement? I'm defining a movement. This is my own definition. You can challenge it with pleasure. Is sustained mobilization around a strategy to achieve an objective. Now, let me ask you, who of you have been involved or are involved currently in a movement? What is the movement? What is it called? Tila?
Yeah, actually, I'm from Nepal. Nepal was organized one movement, Kamaya movement, born in Nepal. In that movement, I think in 2000, that movement takes 9 months time. So that was the freedom. The main objective was how to freedom the boundary Nepal.
Okay, so you've got the movement is called BASE Nepal, huh?
Yeah.
And they have a campaign to free bonded labor.
BASE was the leading organization at the time, but many other organizations also supported that movement.
Brilliant. So there you have the building of a coalition, of a movement which involves one organization bringing in other organizations as part of a broad coalition. Who else has got an example of a movement? Aliu?
Yeah, we have the Francophone network and the Francophone CSO, Civil Society Organization Network. It's about more than 20 countries, organizations from more than 20 countries. And we are trying to improve good governance in sub-Saharan Africa to fight corruption using collective action tools like collectivized frontline, SNS, and so on.
So does it involve sustained mobilization?
Yeah.
There's an objective. The objective is to achieve good governance.
Yeah.
What is the strategy in that case?
The strategy?
Yeah.
We have in sub-Saharan Africa many NGOs working to fight corruption and to improve good governance with, say, many tactics and many strategies, different tactics and different strategies. What we are trying to do is to bring all these NGOs together to build a strong coalition to fight corruption in sub-Saharan Africa. And we are using same tools, same tactics, same objectives, and we are trying to do, say, a transnational action, not only, for instance, my organization is working in Guinea, but I can also work in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and so on. You know,
Yeah,
so we are working together. We are trying to do everything together to improve good governance in all sub-Saharan Africa.
Great, thank you, Aliu. So a coalition of NGOs may not be a movement, but it may become a movement if it engages in sustained mobilization around a strategy to achieve an objective. I'm not sure where exactly, at what stage this is. When does something become a movement? Seven.
Yeah, just a suggestion. I think it makes sense to make a difference between a social movement organization and a social movement. Otherwise, we easily become into the situation where an NGO is the same as a social movement. And in my view, social movements is more of a broader network of organizations and individuals and so on. But
Yeah.
that's
No,
my
thanks,
suggestion.
Selim, that's very useful. But we're not talking here only about social movements. We're talking about political movements, liberation movements, resistance movements, labor movements. I mean, these are movements, and the term movement is not used loosely. It's used to mean a particular kind of animal that we're dealing with here. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from a land rights movement in India, and we find, I mean, for the sustained mobilization, like I just speak to him that the time of one-day demonstration is over. So every government knows how to deal with you. They'll provide ambulance, they'll provide you water, they'll provide you passes, so that by the evening you can go back. So what we find that the foot march is one of the best ways to create a constant pressure, to create a constant headache for the government. And what we have practiced since last 10 years, we did many foot marches in India. I mean, last time I remember when with 25,000 people, we walked from Gwalior to Delhi, about 400 kilometers. We just gave one single message to our Prime Minister, since you have no time to meet us, so that is why 25,000 people to walking in the national highway, and they are coming to meet you. And blocking a national highway is offense, but walking in the national highway is not offense. So that we find is the best way for the sustained mobilization. And in between you can take sympathy and solidarity from the many actors like media, lawyers, and other things.
Brilliant. Thanks for that wonderful example.
I actually have a question. So it seems like probably sustained mobilization is one of the greatest challenges for a movement. And what do you consider mobilization? If there's a lot of planning, like we are all familiar now with the national example, there were months and months and months of planning of what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. Or, you know, the CSOs in South Africa might be planning for a while and yet nothing really is happening on the ground. Or is even that a question that you're concerned with?
It is. It's absolutely a critical question. And if you look at, I mean, I think in these protracted struggles, and I think we'll have a session on protracted struggles, that mobilization goes through phases. So in South Africa in the 1950s, we had a phase of non-violent mobilization around from 1952 until 1960. There were numerous campaigns. I mean, it was sustained for those first 8 years of the implementation of apartheid laws. And in 1960, the whole terrain shifted with Sharpeville and the banning of the organizations and so on. And then there was a whole build-up in the 70s until Soweto 76. Then there was another clampdown. Then from the 80s, there was another build-up of mobilization. So there were these phases. I must tell you, it wasn't planned. It wasn't front-loaded. We didn't sit and say, okay, we are now going to start this mobilization and sustain it until 1989. It was actually quite organic in the way that movement developed, in the way in which it was mobilized. I think it's important to look at this issue of terminology in South Africa, just so that people don't get confused. I mean, we talked about the movement, and my comrade Howard will confirm this, that for us the movement was the ANC, which was the liberation movement. That was the overarching movement that we worked with. It was illegal, it was banned, so we couldn't publicly organize the movement as we understood it. But we had this whole range of what we called community-based organizations or mass-based organizations. Mass-based meant they were not NGOs. These were organizations of thousands or hundreds of thousands of residents or workers or school children or university students or youth who were organized into constituency-based organizations, which were their own self-organized structures with their own demands. They then came together to form these broader coalitions. So the United Democratic Front was one, which was a movement in its own right, which had specific objectives and a specific strategy to achieve those objectives. COSATU is the Labour Federation. So all of these trade unions eventually came together in 1985 to form a Labour Federation. After the UDF was banned, this is getting a bit complicated, but it's important just to have a sort of framework of understanding this. In 1988, 1989, the components of the UDF and COSATU, the labour movement, came together to form what we called the Mass Democratic Movement, the MDM. So don't get too hung up on organizational structures. We are all part of the same movement, all these different organizations that I'm talking about here. The other thing to be aware of is that the UDF is the United Democratic Front. Now, of course, it was called a front for the communists, it was called a front for the ANC, called a front for the Soviet Union, etc. But it was a front in a different sense, in that it was a united front in the sense of a coalition of different groupings. And it brought together a range of different constituencies under one umbrella for one particular objective and one particular campaign. Okay, we talked a lot about the issue of alliances. We touched on this yesterday. When do you form alliances? Like, on what terms? Who can be part of your alliance? If somebody's using violence, can they be part? If they agree with you on some things but not on other things, can they be part? This was one of the biggest debates we had at the founding of the UDF, was who is in and who is out? Who becomes part of this movement or not? And it wasn't a question of who's using violence or not, because we were going to try and operate within the above-ground legal framework. So there was an ANC underground which was operating. We weren't in that terrain. There was an ANC military wing operating in exile, training people in camps. We weren't operating that terrain. We were organizing a mass-based opposition to certain government institutions. So the big debate was, who's part of this? Are the trade unions going to be part of it? Are whites going to be part of it? Is it going to be non-racial? Are we going to put black unity above non-racial unity? Are we going to put working class unity above national unity? Who comes into this? What we call the ultra-left, the Trotskyist-inspired left wing in the Western Cape, they pulled out. They said, no, we're not going to entertain an alliance with these middle-class white organizations, including my organization, which was NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students. And they said, we are the children of the bourgeoisie. So we don't want to have an alliance with the children of the bourgeoisie. Anyway, so the UDF leadership, which included some of the underground ANC leadership, said, no, our understanding at this point is that it's more important to build a non-racial front, which will include whites, middle-class people, etc., in this alliance. That is our priority. That was the direction the UDF took. It was not easy, and it was quite controversial. It did exclude some people. So it's important not to have a sort of naive view that this was a sort of happy organization that everybody could join and so on. These things were fought about at every stage along the way. Okay. So I'm going to just take you through the UDF here. Where's my... Okay, the first question I'm posing is what's needed to have a successful movement? And I'm going to refer back quite a lot to Hardy's great introduction yesterday to these questions. The first thing is a vision. What do you want to achieve? And in South Africa, the guiding document for the UDF and for the ANC was the Freedom Charter. And I haven't got a copy, but you can easily access it on the internet. It's a document which starts, as I think Jack mentioned, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. So that was the vision. That was the starting point of the movement. And we took this from 1955. It was created through a popular process in the 1950s, so we didn't have to reinvent something new. And here you can see this is a picture of the black and white student leadership when I was the general secretary of the student union. And the white woman, no, this is Kate Phillip, who was the president of the white student union. I was the general secretary. And we were with the black student leaders here on the same platform. And you can see what it says. It's demonstrating non-racial unity. Okay. Yes, you can. Yeah, South Africa, highly segregated society. And 1970s, with the Black Consciousness Movement, Steve Biko and the black students were asserting their right to self-organization, building their capacity and so on. They broke away from what was then the liberal white student organization and formed a separate black student organization. We were organizing on campuses, university colleges, which were almost entirely white because the colleges were all segregated. So we maintained our white student organization and organized as we became increasingly left-wing and aligned with the movement as a whole. So what happened in the 1980s was that these black student movements and our white student movement came together, and we started working closely together. And that photograph is an illustration of that moment when we built this strong cooperative relationship. By 1988, they had merged into one, which was called SASCO, South African Students' Congress. But it took a few years to get that together. So what do you need next to build a movement? You need a trigger, something that's going to mobilize people, to get people angry, something that's going to be of importance to them, that's going to unite them. In South Africa, it was the 1983 reforms. The National Party government, the apartheid government, introduced these really weird reforms because they decided that they had to try and accommodate other people of other races in some way in order to placate them, to allow for the building of a black middle class, to co-opt certain sectors of the population, to divide and rule, to sustain their power base, if you like. Very interesting. Anyway, there's a long detail about this whole reform initiative, which we can discuss, which Howard and I can give you more input on. But what the apartheid government suggested was the introduction of a tricameral parliament where people of mixed race and people of Indian descent would be represented, and in proportion to their population. Black people would still, the black majority, which was 70% of the population, would still have no citizenship, no vote, and they would be expected to vote in their homelands, which is part of the struggle. And they were given these local councils, black local authorities. So when I refer to, when you see this term, BLA, that's a black local authority. That's what was considered a puppet body for the administration of people, urban black people living in what we call the townships, the locations. And these puppet bodies were elected, they were meant to be elected. So a lot of the resistance, especially in urban areas, was focused on these black local authorities. So that was the trigger, the implementation of this tricameral parliament with elections for that parliament and the implementation of the black local authorities. Okay. Leadership, I'm going to talk a little bit more about leadership. Very interesting in South Africa that you had a situation where the leadership of the movement, the ANC, the liberation movement, was either in prison, Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, as you know, or in exile. Oliver Tambo was in fact the person who was de facto leading the movement, and he was in London or Lusaka, depending on when you're talking about. So we had to build leadership from the bottom up in South Africa. And we had to try and link in with the leadership in exile or on Robben Island to try and make decisions and strategize and so on. Incredibly difficult, incredibly difficult. But it had some advantages. The advantages were that we, as a movement, were not dominated by one big man who stood there and made decisions. Nelson Mandela was a very profoundly important leader for us, but he was a symbolic leader. We couldn't go and talk to him and discuss strategy with him. He did discuss strategy with generations of young people who were taken to Robben Island and who were involved with debates and education programs and so on. Then they would be released after 7 years or 10 years or whatever it was, come back into the community, start reorganizing and so on. So there was a back and forth between the leadership on the island, the leadership in exile, and the leadership internally. But as a movement, we had to build our own leadership. An organizational base, I've talked a little bit about that because you've seen that from the late 70s, we were already organizing different constituencies. And we organized a lot. We drew a lot on the Philippines example, not the 1986 EDSA revolution, which you have heard about, but what happened right through from the 70s in the Philippines in terms of organizing base Christian communities, local socialist communities, organizing people around their own interests to confront authority, to refuse to comply with authority. Very, very profoundly important lessons for us from the Philippines. So we started organizing at that kind of grassroots level. All these different organizations, as I mentioned them before, residents of particular areas, students, youth, women, labor organizations. Okay, so now, the critical issue of the strategy. When the government introduces these reforms, we start this movement to respond to those reforms. What is the strategy? The strategy is simply to delegitimize those institutions. Delegitimize them. The government must not succeed in implementing this reform strategy, which will divide people and divide them on racial lines and co-opt them into different structures which are going to assist in implementing apartheid policy. How do we implement that strategy? Through this broad unity of with a range of different allies. Okay, here's just a photograph of a bus, an ordinary public transport bus, used in the early stages of mobilization in Port Elizabeth, where the youth activists would go onto the buses, walk up and down the aisles, sometimes distribute leaflets if they had leaflets, otherwise just talk to people, shout slogans, etc. on the buses. Public transport. I can promise you we had minimal resources. There were very, 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 very little money around. As somebody involved in the student organization and as a sort of fairly affluent middle-class white person, we had access to printing presses and, we could produce some media, but there surely wasn't funding. We didn't get donor funding to set up NGOs and media campaigns and this kind of thing. It was all done in means like this. Okay, so we look at the different component elements of this movement. We had an organizational structure. The UDF set up regional, what we called provincial structures. So I was in the Western Cape when the UDF started, and then I moved to the Eastern Cape. And each province or each region elected an executive, got together all the different component organizations who were affiliated to the UDF and elected an executive. So it did have a reasonably democratic structure. The executive also elected a national executive. We had figureheads as well who were the UDF patrons, who were old activists from the 50s who symbolized what the movement had stood for in the past. And very deliberately non-racial, included church leaders, included labor leaders, and so on, so that we could present the public leadership as appealing to as broad a constituency as possible. It was very difficult to organize the UDF as a democratic national organization, which it was. But it had one national launch, which was a very big conference. And then it had one national conference that I remember. It might have had another one at some stage. But before the state of emergency and the extensive repression, we had one big national conference where delegates came from all the provinces and all the affiliates and took decisions and so on. So there was when there was space, when there was the political space to maneuver, we did hold public and accountable democratic processes. Branding and public presence. The UDF did get some funding at a national level from the EU mainly, from European countries, and they did put that into developing a public presence. So you saw at the beginning this poster here. UDF unites, apartheid divides. Very simple slogan, forward to people's power, simple demand. This logo designed with the flag, very interesting. It's showing a mass of people engaged in action, in marching. It's not showing Nelson Mandela's face or an AK-47, whatever. It's a nice, popular resistance image. Big debates about colour. If we used green, black, and gold, that was the ANC colours. So we would immediately get into trouble. So we had this long debate. What can we do? How should we deal with this? We said, okay, we'll replace the green with red, which is also the Communist Party colour, of course. So we'll try and duck the issue. And it worked. You know, we managed to maintain those colours for a while. Gradually, what happened, of course, was that as the ANC became more and more unbanned through people's own action, we started increasingly using the colours of the ANC publicly. So you would have funerals where the ANC flags would be brought out, Communist Party flags would be brought out. They were illegal, but it was a sort of creating the space in which we could gradually legitimize our own movement. Okay, the critical thing about mobilization here is what Hardy was talking about yesterday in terms of the spreading of tactics from one place to another. So you saw that consumer boycott. Consumer boycotts were then taken up in numerous towns, small towns, cities, villages. You can have a targeted consumer boycott around particular goods. Workers on strike in a particular industry would have a call for a consumer boycott of that product, of that particular factory. In Port Elizabeth, as you saw, the consumer boycott was called of all white traders in the city centre to bring the city business leaders to put pressure on the government and on the city administration. So that's one tactic which can be used in numerous ways, spread out into all different cities, all different kinds of places. Simultaneous use of the same tactic in many places at one time. Very hard for government to reach out into all those areas and control what's happening at one time if it happens simultaneously. So an example would be the elections for the black local authorities, where there was an election boycott. Boycott is just one tactic, and then various forms of pressure on councillors to defect if they were standing for election, to disrupt the meetings of the black local authority councillors. And I mean, I must tell you that in some cases this was coercive and sometimes violent pressure, but in general it wasn't. I mean, it's hard to draw the line in this case. This wasn't a very disciplined non-violent movement, and I'm going to come back to this issue. Okay. The importance here is also to look at the sequencing of tactics, i.e., this wasn't a demonstration. This was a period of 2 years or so of sustained mobilization and of an escalation of mobilization and of people being creative and experimenting with different tactics and copying tactics that were being used in other places. So it allowed for some local flexibility and creativity. We weren't under a very highly centralized, highly disciplined organization, which had a sort of command center or an executive which was telling people what they must do at every stage of the game. And they would say, okay, the campaign now is against the black local authorities, against the elections to the authorities. But then people in different areas would take that up in slightly different ways. There was a national strategy and a national direction. This is just a nice picture of women organization. That is me, by the way. And I'm sitting with Mary Burton, who was the chairperson of the Black Sash, which was a liberal white women's organization. not militant, but very committed human rights defenders. So they played a very important role. It was very important for us to have them as allies on our platforms. So here, this is just to unpack what I've been saying now about the tactics and show how it developed in different phases. We had, as I've explained, the development of these mass-based organizations around local issues, the formation of a national coordinating structure in 1983 to counter the reform strategy and to delegitimize them. By 1984 was when the elections happened, and they were boycotted. And then the UDF had developed this enormous momentum by 1985. What was called the Township Uprising started. It was like our intifada in the townships. And end of September 84 is generally termed the beginning of that uprising. By early 85, this movement had developed beyond our imagination, beyond our wildest dreams, as one of the academics who's written about it is Enneke van Kissel. If any of you are interested in reading more about this, she's actually written a book and a thesis called Beyond Our Wildest Dreams. And it just took off. It took off and developed a dynamic of its own. The problem then is, how do you contain this? How do you steer and control this incredible energy that is released in this movement? And it wasn't a disciplined nonviolent movement. It was often quite an undisciplined movement and quite wild. It allowed for, I mean, look, this is a big country. It's not as big as some of the countries that you come from, but it was about 42 million people, I think, at that time. And yeah. Okay, so by 1985, when this movement had gained momentum, the black local authorities were delegitimized. They were, in most cases, no longer functioning. And the ANC, as our overarching movement, called on us to render government institutions unworkable, to make apartheid unworkable, to make the country ungovernable. Okay, now this sounds like a recipe for anarchy. So this is what people did. They actually made these institutions dysfunctional, unworkable. All sorts of institutions, educational institutions, the local authorities that people were paying rent to, I'll go through some of the specific campaigns here. The idea was that we would then put into place alternative institutions, our own structures of people's power. You've got to see this as a partial thing. This wasn't a direct challenge to state power at national level. And of course, because of the nature of apartheid society, black people were living in segregated residential areas, these townships. That was where the movement was able to assert control and to gain legitimacy and gain control. And that was where the alternative institutions were put into place. We couldn't do it at national level. So it's important to bear that in mind. This was a very partial process. And by this stage, the government realized that things were going out of control. In fact, some of the security force members have said subsequently, we lost control. In the Eastern Cape townships in 1985, we lost control. So we had to regain control. They got instructions from the Minister of Defense to regain control at all costs. And they started issuing heavy ammunition, live ammunition, and they put in place a state of emergency and arrested without trial thousands and thousands of people. And this was really, that the state had the strength to do that, to assert control through force, through violence. But they couldn't re-legitimize themselves. They could not re-establish legitimacy. So what you had was what I've called a holding strategy here, which is the next sort of couple of years, which is we actually couldn't move forward. There was a stalemate. We really couldn't do very much in that situation. Most of us were sitting in prison, and there were like movements against repression, like the organizations to free the children, campaigns to release detainees, etc. But these are defensive. Okay, these are not taking things forward. So it's not right to perceive this movement as sort of moving in a steady uphill mobilization towards the end point when we attain freedom. I mean, there was a sort of long period of stasis, of not being sure how to move forward. On to phase 6 here, we have the 1989 Defiance Campaign. And this is where the shift happens. It's what's called in Latin American politics the abertura, the opening up of space. When the reformists within the regime start seeing that there has to be a way out of the stalemate. They have to look for some place where they can engage with the opponents and regain legitimacy and try and put some kind of transition in place. And that's what happened in South Africa. So within the apartheid government, they were feeling the pinch of international pressure, of international sanctions, which was very much part of the movement's broad strategy. So international support was an integral part of that process and that strategy. The apartheid government was struggling. Economically, it was struggling, and it was losing legitimacy. And of course, then there was the end of the Cold War, which shifted the whole balance of power in the world. So it allowed for that opening to take place. And we could then take that gap and remobilize the movement and engage in a whole series of acts of defiance. We took control of the city centres and marched into the cities and this kind of thing. It was great. The remaining apartheid laws were scrapped by then, through this process. It was really weird because the past laws had been abandoned in 1986 already. And in 1989, there were still these weird discriminatory laws about using beaches, and we did nice campaigns, which Jim would like, going and occupying the beaches and playing soccer on them and preventing, not actually disrupting anything, but claiming them for our own, claiming them as a public space, which wasn't racially defined. Big hunger strike. There was a lot of people in jail in 1989. So one of the last acts of that whole phase was a protracted hunger strike by detainees. And by the end of 1989, I think most of the detainees were released. Okay. This wasn't the end of the struggle. So the ANC was unbanned in 1990. Remember when Nelson Mandela was released? And that was a major victory, of course. And then the next 4 years of that transition were incredibly messy, incredibly violent, much more violent, in fact, than the 3 decades of struggle before that. It's just an interesting lesson because the ANC was engaged in an armed struggle for 3 decades. Fewer people died in that armed struggle than in the 4-year period when the ANC suspended armed struggle. So it's just something to bear in mind. You mustn't ignore this transitional phase and think that, as soon as you lay down your arms, everything is going to be fine, if that's the case. The last phase was involved with the creation of a unitary state, which was our demand, and the destruction of these homeland governments, homeland institutions. And that was also quite a violent process in some cases. But parallel to that was a very positive and non-violent process of renegotiating single cities. So our demand was one city, one municipality. We don't want a black municipality and a white municipality and a coloured labour committee, coloured area committee and this kind of rubbish. We said one city, one municipality. And our city, Port Elizabeth, where the consumer boycott was was the very first city in South Africa to have a non-racial municipality. And that was through people's own actions. And we had sit-ins in the black local authority offices for days and days. Women sat in and occupied these offices, and the black councillors couldn't function, the administrators couldn't function. Eventually they conceded. And they had a negotiation for the new non-racial municipality, which actually excluded these guys. So it was quite interesting. They were so illegitimate that they didn't even get included in the negotiations in the end. Okay, and then of course you know what happened with the national negotiations. So here's a nice poster from Port Elizabeth, the UDF poster. The overall demand, the vision, the people shall govern. Simple democracy, non-racial, democratic state, unitary state, that was the overall demand. Within that, you have a campaign, a consumer boycott. Okay, so here are examples of all the different campaigns which made up this movement over those years. I've talked about a lot of them already. Let me just see if there's any that I haven't. I mean, there was quite a lot of innovation, things like combining of consumer boycott and work stay away for a 3-day period. It was what we called a Black Weekend. Whoa. Yeah, and I think I've dealt with all of these things. You can ask me about more. You can ask me about details of them if you want.
Just to go back to the phases, I think it was 86, 87, you said that they started using live ammunition in the townships, and there was this really violent crackdown. And it kind of seemed to me also in Boutros that when they occupied Boutros and they started using live ammunition, and is this a recognized stage of a nonviolent conflict where you have kind of the oppressor kind of in some way accepts or is kind of put off balance by the nonviolence, and then comes in and becomes increasingly violent, and then I guess you'd have two possible trajectories from there, or is this just happened to be something that happened in these two cases?
I think you could argue that this is a phase, it's a situation that you have to anticipate, because there's no repressive or authoritarian government that's going to allow people to mobilize indefinitely without at some point cracking down on them. So you need to have some anticipation of that and plan, okay, what is the way to respond to that? I think we're going to talk quite a bit in the next couple of sessions about costs and risks and about security forces and how you deal with those situations. But I mean, I would say that is true. This is just a nice march we had in PE and to the townships. Took all the white people into the townships. Often, for many of them, it was the first time they'd been inside a township. And you can see how we were welcomed by the people in the townships there. Jim?
But one of the problems in South Africa during this period, 1994, 88, 94, was it not also the fact that, I can't think of the party, but the Bethelisu King.
Yes, Boutros.
Yeah, he made a strong effort to cut down and to kill ANC people, did he not? UDF people.
Yeah.
So there were massive killings in the hundreds of people in certain sections.
Yeah.
But this was a, I'm not sure how to describe that.
I'll explain it. I think it's a very important thing to describe. What Jim Lawson is talking about is Buthelezi, who is the head of the Zulu Nationalist movement, which was called Inkatha, and then became the Inkatha Freedom Party. From the mid-80s, they came into conflict with the UDF, and it resulted in an extremely violent conflict. This was not an ethnic conflict, because in fact in the province where this party was strong, it was all Zulu people, but some supported the UDF and some supported the Zulu Nationalist movement. Inkatha was in control of the KwaZulu administration, which was one of the homelands. They claimed, Buthelezi claimed, that they were committed to non-violent anti-apartheid work, and that they were going to use this homeland institution as a way of maintaining their movement and sustaining their resources and so on. But they would not accept independence, as some of the other homelands had done. This wasn't good enough. I mean, really, for the UDF and for the ANC, it was considered to be too great a compromise, because they were actually administering these homeland areas and using their resources in doing that. And it became a very violent conflict. Inkatha then, by the 90s, by that transition, moved into the area around Johannesburg, the industrial area. And they had a base there among migrant workers, Zulu migrant workers in the hostels and so on. And they started being supplied with arms and with protection by the police and so on as a third, what we call the third force. Now, there's a huge debate in South Africa still about whether this was an organized third force or what was the exact dynamic around it. But it's a very important dynamic, because this was a black nationalist movement. You know, it was not white criminals who were attacking.
Mandela did accuse the Nationalist Party and government of supplying the weapons for Mobilisation and this national effort.
Yes, he did.
And
there is evidence that they did supply them.
ANC did not want to, they were reluctant to engage in any kind of self-defense business against that force, because it was within the African community and the effort to create a new society.
Well, no. Well, I wish that were the case, but in fact what happened was that people within the ANC and the UDF said, we demand a right to self-defense. And if the government can't protect us, which they obviously can't because they are on the other side, we are going to demand that our MK, the soldiers of the liberation movement, must protect us. People were demanding guns, yeah, they were wanting guns, and they set up self-defense units which were trained, militarily trained, to fight the Inkatha people. And that's what led to this escalation of violence. That's why so many thousands of people died. And I'm talking here 20, 30,000 people. Yeah.
Janet, I would like you to address one of the prevailing still misconceptions about the transition that happened in South Africa. And that when I talk to some quite well-educated people in Poland, for example, the perception that they have is that actually violence rather than non-violent movement brought about the change. And so I would like you to address this kind of misconception, but also making that more kind of challenging for you. I was wondering whether you could talk about the kind of radical flank effect, which is essentially, even if the armed group is not using violence openly, stays dormant, but still the fact that it exists may influence the willingness of the government to negotiate with less radical, non-violent element because of the existence of armed group that may take over that non-violent movement. Eventually, the government is actually afraid of that.
Yeah.
Did it play a role? And if so, what kind of? Or if it didn't, why?
Yeah, that's a very important question, but I don't see it as a radical flank effect in that sense, because this was one movement. Now, I don't agree with the people who say that it was the armed struggle that brought about change, because I don't think the armed struggle was very effective. Whether or not you think it was right or wrong. I mean, we had our position in South Africa was that this is a just war. The ANC had a right to take up arms and so on. But it's not what we can do. We can't do that. It's not, I mean, you know, there were thousands of young people who went for military training and who sat in Angola for years and years and years. They could not get back. They could not fight. I mean, they were immensely frustrated. So I think the most effective thing in this movement was this mobilization, which resulted in the delegitimization of state institutions. Now, the thing is that it wasn't a radical flank effect in the sense that there were two components, i.e. there was a non-violent component and there was this radical militant component. We were absolutely part of one integrated movement. And so it wasn't a case of government saying, well, who can we negotiate with? It was interesting because both within the government and within the ANC, there was this debate about, the hardliners and the softliners within each movement. So within the ANC leadership, there were those who said, yeah, okay, now it's time to reach out and start negotiating. And there were those who were saying, this is what they called two-track, Howard, two-track, that we need to maintain our military capacity so that we can seize state power if the negotiations don't reach the optimal outcome. And that was the dynamic that was going on in that process. I wanted to talk a little bit about this issue of strategic coherence, because there's a book that came out last year called People's War. This is Anthea Jeffrey. I don't know, have you read this, Howard? Now, if you read that book and you read Stephen Zuna's account of the South African struggle, you would think they were talking about two different countries. So, which analysis is correct? Anthea Jeffrey is using the analysis that would have been used by the CIA in the 1980s, I'm absolutely sure, by the apartheid securocrats, by many Western liberal people who argued that the ANC, the liberation movement, had a strategy of people's war, which it did, and that people's war involves mobilization, which is inherently coercive and violent and brutal. And this is why people managed to undermine these institutions. And the ANC, through that process of people's war, established its hegemony over the black population and managed to win the negotiations and put a majority government in place in which it is the dominant party. So we have a dominant party state in South Africa and we don't have federalism and so on. Look, I mean, I don't agree with her politically, but there is a point to what she's saying. And I think it's important to analyze this. Like, what was the relationship between the violent strategies? There was an armed struggle going on, and there was a strategy of protracted people's war, of arming the masses. This is what the ANC said they wanted to do in 1985. Want to bring in weapons, we want to arm the masses. We've got this mass base. Here they are, they're waiting for us. What do we do with them? We must build our people's army, distribute weapons, get them to try and take power. Didn't work so easily, but I mean, we can have this debate about how effective it was. But my argument against this is that you simply cannot coerce millions of people into adopting these kinds of actions and these kinds of tactics. And I was there. I mean, I know people were not coerced. I've also done research on this, on people within townships at grassroots level. What did they think? How did they participate? How did they support their movement? What kinds of actions could they take? They were not coerced. I mean, I can tell you this empirically from the studies that I've done. Which really leads me to this thing about, was there a strategic coherence? In Palestine, people talk about all means of struggle, and that you have to maintain this openness to all means of struggle. If you want a disciplined, non-violent movement, isn't any form of violence a detraction? Isn't it going to undermine your strategy in some way? It's a very important issue to address. Okay, I've got Stellan first.
Please. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was in South Africa in 1994 to interview people that were working both in the MK and within the UDF and so on. And my impression is that we need to put this into proportion. That if we compare with Palestine, it's a big difference with the armed struggle in South Africa, because it was quite symbolic. If you look on the number of actions that were done inside South Africa, it was quite limited. And there is a talk about that the armed struggle started already in the 1960s. But if you look on what kind of actions that were happening, it was sabotage against the industries and electricity and so on. So I think it's a more relevant question for me to ponder about why was not ANC taking the armed struggle seriously, like in Palestine, using terrorism. And I think that is a very interesting question. It's of course difficult to answer, but to me that proves that the movement was really mainly a peaceful resistance. There was this important symbolic armed resistance, yes, united in one movement. But it was not like the main strategy, at least not inside South Africa. And I know there was a debate about the strategies in the 60s, but the terrorist strategy was not happening. And there was people that were really very strong, like Oliver Tambo and so on discouraging attacks on civilians. There were some occasions, and it happened later on by units that were not really in control by Oliver Tambo. So I think this misconception about the struggle as being an armed struggle is a problem for history record. Because in my understanding, the struggle in South Africa was really mass-based, peaceful resistance with violent occasions.
I want to ask Howard to respond to that. You know, Howard wrote his doctoral thesis on MK, on the armed struggle. But I wanted to say, in April this year, our president, Jacob Zuma, made a speech where he said our freedom was brought about by armed struggle. Anyway, Howard, just...
if one takes one day of the insurgency in Iraq, at the height of the insurgency following the invasion in 2003, okay? One day, there were more military actions in Iraq in one day than in the entire ANC armed struggle from 1960 to 1990. So I think that puts it in some sort of perspective. And the South African population is substantially larger than Iraq's, if I'm correct. And also, yeah, well, I think that figure speaks for itself. I think that where there's a paradox here, okay? The ANC did not, the leadership of the movement did not ignore armed struggle. The paradox is that it actually overemphasized the armed struggle, withdrew people from political activity, and paradoxically, through actually emphasizing armed struggle, failed up until about 1979, 1980, to give any real effect. This is between 1960, and about 1979, 1980, failed to give any real effect to developing an internal political base on which it could base an armed struggle. So the paradox is that the ANC's very emphasis on armed struggle led to its failure to, or partly explains its failure in getting an armed struggle that went anywhere at all. And it was a spectacular failure. I mean, we were spectacularly ineffective. And I think that paradoxically too, a lot of the ANC's reputation for moral rectitude in armed struggle, for not actually going for what return civilian targets, etc., stems not so much from moral rectitude in fact, but in fact from our ineptitude and incompetence. No, I'm serious. I mean, I know it sounds a bit as I've got an axe to grind, but it's actually, I think it's actually,
it's true.
It's actually true. And you know, when I told the story at the last FSI, and this story will actually put things in context a bit. some of the more thoughtful leaders of the ANC in about 1978-79 were, 2 years after the armed struggle so-called had been resumed, which meant one attack a month probably, had been resumed in late 1976, early 77. 2 years later, this armed struggle they recognized was getting nowhere. And they thought, well, what the hell do we do? And one of them suggested, well, our friends in Vietnam have just managed to displace the American-backed regime in South Vietnam, and the American embassy has been vacated in a panic, etc. We must go and talk to the Vietnamese. They know how to do this. And they went off to Vietnam, and they met people like General Giap and the other leading personalities in the Vietnamese struggle. And the Vietnamese asked for a briefing, and they gave them a briefing for a day, and they were feeling rather pleased with themselves. They went off that night and had a nice dinner somewhere in Hanoi. And the next morning they came back to hear the Vietnamese response. And the Vietnamese response was, you guys are nowhere. You've got it all completely wrong. You shouldn't even be engaged in an armed struggle. You should be engaged in political struggle by political means in the legal and semi-legal spheres and in developing an underground. Now, what they were saying was that the ANC had not actually grappled with the primary issue, was not grappling at that point with the primary issue, which was developing organization among people and mobilizing people by political means. Okay, not by military means, by political means, by non-violent political means. And another thing that the ANC was not doing, according to the Vietnamese, which was a very important insight, and I think that Janet will remember how important, well, it didn't come through in this form, but how important it was when people eventually tumbled to this truth. What the Vietnamese were saying was, you need to work in the legal and semi-legal spheres. There is a semi-legal sphere, and you're all the time trying to work in that sphere and to legalize your movement or legalize its objective. And out of that came the ANC's agreement with a process which was already underway inside the country by more far-sighted activists, who, many of whom considered themselves ANC, or considered themselves trying to further the aims which were broadly associated with the ANC's quite eloquent democratic commitment. But so the ANC formal leadership actually followed the actions of far-sighted, autonomous, in most cases at that stage, this is the late 1970s, early 1980s, actually followed the autonomous activists inside the country who were developing non-violent forms of struggle and mobilizing people politically by political means. And there is this paradox. Okay, and I don't know whether you would agree or disagree with that, but I think that that's really what happened. The ANC, I wrote one paper when I was doing my thesis called Leading from Behind. The ANC led from behind. Oh, that's a paradox, but it led from behind for a long, long, long time. And it was only late 80s that it begins to sort of catch up. And by virtue of its patent commitment to armed struggle, in other words, its patent will to take on the South African regime, the apartheid regime, by the most extreme means, it develops an authority, a legitimacy, and it has sort of almost checks to cash, or sort of legitimacy checks to cash, and it begins to assume, by some good judgment on its own part as well, leadership of the struggle again. But for a substantial period in the early 1980s, it's leading from behind. It's actually taking its lead from people like Janet inside the country who were working in this area and in this way.
Well, I agree, but the problem comes when you reach 1985. Yeah. So then you've got this movement, which is mobilized inside the country, captured the legal space, etc. Then 1985, here, look, I mean, I was a member of the ANC underground, so I was getting this back and forth information very irregularly, by the way. And we would say, what do we do now? Like, what's the strategic direction? We sure weren't getting it from Lusaka, you know? They weren't sending us information and saying, okay, now the next step in your nonviolent struggle is to do X, Y, and Z, and so on. So we were just, like, you know, playing it by ear and working out what we should do the next day. The ANC strategy at that point was people's war. It was arm the masses, try and bring in weapons. And people responded to that. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I don't think Howard's right, because it's true the ANC armed struggle was very ineffective, and there were very few armed actions, and they were very restrained and very disciplined. It was a very disciplined movement. But in the townships, once this mobilization had occurred, people said, oh, we follow the ANC, Oliver Tambo, Joe Slovo, etc., and they're calling for us to adopt a people's war. So what do? We build traps to sabotage and capture the SADF, that's the South African Defence Force vehicles, and we lure the soldiers out of them and we try and kill them if we can. They didn't manage to kill very many, but they tried. I mean, this was young people. They weren't part of any armed group. They weren't trained militarily. They were just trying to take action, and they thought this was the strategy. This was what they must do. They built up their own paramilitary formations. They did. So that integration at tactical level was on the ground, you know. It wasn't like the MK outside there and the non-violent movement inside. There was a high level of integration.
I'm sure there was that potential. I'm just saying the ANC was never capable of actually developing that potential for a variety of reasons. One of which is that it sat in exile, setting up elaborate structures and then saying, well, what should we do with them? Instead of saying, what do we want to do, and let's set up appropriate structures to do it. It was sort of completely cart about the horse kind of way of going about things. But you know, there were conditions in which the ANC could indeed have really developed quite an interesting kind of quasi-urban guerrilla type of activity, and they nearly did with some of the called the grenade squads or whatever.
Yeah.
But it was so badly organized, so weakly led, that the South Africans managed to penetrate it, give these people booby-trap grenades, and blow off the arms of 5 or 6 young people, and that was the end of the grenade squad thing. You know, so anyway.
Okay, 15 minutes?
May I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Actually, because it's a very interesting session. My impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, in this case study, it's very clear there's institutionalized discrimination which manifests itself in segregation. So you have one core issue around which to mobilize people. My question is, coming from countries where we are, in the case of India, and in this day and age, issues are a lot more diffuse. So for example, we're dealing with a very intensive Maoist conflict, which is identity-based, which is resource-based, which is land-based. So when you have multiple issues and you want to address them, in terms of mobilizing, in terms of bringing people together at the very initial stage, what would be some of your recommendations? Because the issues are not as clear-cut. And you know, we have very progressive laws, so it's not institutionalized discrimination. But you know, we have a whole multitude of issues, and we have to tackle them. So it's not as the case of Nashville, where it was very clear-cut. There's one issue, and that's what you go for. So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's similar to the situation in. I'll get other responses.
I would like to add.
You want to add? Yes, go ahead.
Same context, because there is multiple issues. In this context, there is no doubt that coalition building is important to success the movement. But what happened is, as for example, Nepal, what we see is, after a certain stage, the coalition members started fighting each other for their power sharing and for their own benefit. And
sorry, Stephen's just informed me Bafana scored a goal. Thank you, Stephen. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
So, what happened is, after a certain stage, the coalition members started thinking their own benefits, and they started thinking about their power sharing, and then they forget the common vision, and they started fighting each other. So in this situation, what should be the strategies previously need to be taken besides the common goal? So,
yeah, that's also, these are two related issues. But you see, I think in response to your question, this is like South Africa now, okay? India is comparable to South Africa now. We have democracy, there are multiple struggles and conflicts going on. I would say forget about national mobilization, national struggle, and identify the one issue that you're mobilizing around. I mean, India's massive population, massive country with so many different issues and struggles. So, tackle it struggle by struggle, if you see what I mean, rather than trying to look for one national unifying issue. But this question about power sharing and losing sight of your vision is a more complex thing. And I think there you have a situation where you need to have a consensus, a sort of sufficient consensus, if you like, among the different parties about what is the acceptable outcome, the like minimum acceptable outcome. And it's critical to have that consensus, because if you have some parts of the movement who will accept less or accept something different, or some people wanting autonomy and some people wanting integration, or some people wanting one state and some people wanting two states, that's when you get, that's a critical point of division. And you can't have a united movement if that vision is so different. I'm not sure if I've answered you exactly, but in South Africa it was, the big advantage of this movement was that it was saying the vision is a common vision of a single unitary, non-racial democratic state. And everybody bought into that, with very few exceptions, small minorities who wanted to defend their autonomy or their racial unity or something. Sorry, Nadine.
Just a little comment too. I agree with you on answering this question about we are all working at so many issues and it might be just that you have to focus on one. But if you look sort of outside of this context to other movements in the sense of like the anti-corporate globalization struggle and, for example, the World Trade Organization fight that happened in Seattle, one big lesson that comes out of that is that there was an overarching umbrella message, stop the WTO basically. And under that, everyone fought within their own parameters. And the agreement, in negotiating this was that was okay. So, the Koreans were talking about farming subsidies, and there were people talking about saving sea turtles. And the union folks came in under the union labor laws. And that was okay. And that's a really big learning piece. And that can be applied to a national strategy as well within a country where you can, if you can identify a brief overarching umbrella statement and allow each other to work within your smaller provinces or whatever the delineation is on the specific issues that address your own populations, you can also move forward very effectively in that way, because then you can claim a larger movement. So whether you're working on teen pregnancy or education or taking back the land, if you're under a bigger umbrella of sovereignty, for example, that will help to empower the movement and build more potential for successes, as we were talking yesterday.
Thanks. That's great. Okay, go ahead.
I just want to add some more points. I think in your very previous slide, the whole elements of sustained movement. I think this is my personal view. The one point which is missing is the local resource base for the campaign, because fortunately or unfortunately, most of the campaigns are funded by external agencies. So until the resources are not generated from the own organization, like what you are talking about, the mass base. So if it's the membership-based campaign, then it's more easy to sustain that campaign for the long term. So I think that point is very important. The second point, which is what I'm just thinking, I'm just taking the point what Sushil says, that whenever we are fighting against the transnational agencies or the transnational corporations, that time the level of mobilization is very fine. the leadership, it's okay, because in every country there are some leadership who are taking that initiative. The coalition building is very fine, but the point where most of the movements are failure, it's the advocacy strategies. The all international dynamics, the international level of lobbying. So I think that 2 points I would like to.
Thank you. I agree with you completely.
And
I think South Africa got, yeah.
Do you agree that most campaigns have external funding as their base and source?
No, I don't know how you measure that, but I think the point about self-sufficiency is very important.
Yes,
I mean, if you can generate funding for your own campaign from your own constituency, it's better than being reliant on external funding. But although external funding is fine if you control it, you know, if you're not being dependent on it or manipulated by it. 5 minutes. Who was first here? I know there were Abel, Arwa, Katie. Okay, let me take your 3. I'll start with you, Abel.
I would like to know the impact of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment on the anti-apartheid movement. Did it have any effect, or did it have any positive or negative impact?
Well, strangely, I think it actually had a positive effect. You know, what happened was that in 1963, when he was put on trial, he and that whole, and it wasn't just him, by the way, there was the whole leadership of the ANC who were part of that, were jailed for life. That was a huge blow to the movement, of course, and the movement was banned and people went into exile and so on. It took a while to regenerate a leadership and to establish a leadership in exile and so on. So it was a blow, but overall, you know, there were actually some advantages to having a very powerful symbolic figure who was in prison, and that we could campaign around the minimum demand. He must be released before anything can happen. You know, it was a very positive, concrete goal to have, that he would be released. I think it was very, very difficult for him, personally, but I mean, sorry, let's move on. Katie.
I just want to say that in the United States, at least, I mean, I was like 9 when he was freed, but I think that was a really good rallying call, the Free Nelson Mandela. I mean, I think it allowed lots of people to rally around the cause. So, but yeah. As you said, I'm sure it was negative net for Nelson Mandela. I want to know about the how South Africans perceive performers who violated the boycott, like Elton John and Ray Charles. And also want to know if you think that there is any way that the violence that did accompany the transition could have been prevented, or if that was kind of an inevitable outcome because of the conditions.
The violence in the transition, could it have been prevented? It could have been minimized in some way. I don't think it was necessary that it was so violent. We really struggled with it. It was something that strategically we weren't really prepared for. So I don't know if it could have been eliminated altogether. The question about sanctions, and you're talking about the cultural boycott and people who broke the international sanctions on South Africa. I mean, we were inside South Africa and in the ANC, we were very judgmental, you know. So, you know, we still remember. We remember who broke that boycott. We remember who came to South Africa in 1979 and so on. So, but I mean, yeah, if people broke the boycott, we couldn't sanction them. I don't know. I think it was up to the communities from where they came from to assert some form of pressure or sanction on them.
Was there anyone who, I know this is like when Elton John says he wants to build bridges, I don't believe that, but was there anyone who wanted, who rejected it, who was for the sanctions but against the cultural boycott? Was there any of that in South Africa who argued that it was good to have open cultural?
There was a big debate about the academic boycott and the free exchange of academics. And I was saying this morning that to Stephen Zunis that Howard Zinn, who was a very progressive American academic, came to South Africa on our invitation at the University of Cape Town. And we excluded him from the academic boycott. And it was acceptable because he was being invited by a progressive student organization and so on. So I think these things, you can be quite selective. And I think boycotts always need to be carefully thought through in terms of who is the target, what are you trying to achieve, who is included and excluded and so on.
And sorry, with the minimizing violence, any ideas on how that could have been done?
I think we would have needed to have put into place much faster community-based disciplined structures which could monitor and control violence. I mean, we've been experimenting with this just in the last 2 years around the xenophobic violence, and have in some cases managed to put into place structures to prevent violence. It's not so easy though. Arwa first, and then I'll come back to Jim.
You had mentioned that the UDF had received funding from the EU. Did I understand? Did I hear you correctly?
I don't think the EU was in place then, but it was the European. It was
the EEC, but still.
EEC.
Was that right?
Yeah.
And in what capacity? Was it as an NGO or?
I can't remember. It's in Jeremy Seeking's book. If you want to read an account of the UDF.
I'm just surprised that I wouldn't have thought that they would have supported it, seeing as it was a political movement. That was all. So I wondered if it had profiled itself as something else.
I don't think so. I can't remember. Do you know?
Yeah, the Swedish government was giving lots of money to the ANC. And the ANC was regarded as a terrorist organization. But today, the Swedish government is not doing anything like that. But fortunately, they did.
No, we must look into it. La Duma! Oh, this is very good. Very good news. Okay, last, Jim, I'll take you as the last point.
Well, I think we have to remember, guys, 2010, that we have a massive campaign to get people to think that violence is the only way. We have a massive militarized world with the Western nations at the head of it. So we cannot have a kind of a purity zone in struggle, it seems to be. The CIA revealed to the South African government where Mandela was hiding, as an example. Richard Cheney thought that Mandela should have been hung in the 1980s. We have to come to understand the extent to which we live, especially in the United States, in a militarized, violent society. I'm interested in you saying that the Jeffrey book is probably, from your perspective, a CIA plan. We have this going on all the time in the United States. A new book on the assassination of Martin King, just published this year, is I Am Persuaded. I've read only one or two printed chapters, but there's nothing in the book investigating, using the independent investigations of the assassination by activists like myself, as well as by independent lawyers outside of the official. In the book, there's nothing from that in independent investigation.
No, thank you. I mean, I think this thing of maintaining critical independence in analysing struggles is absolutely crucial. And I do want to say you shouldn't glorify the South African struggle as a wonderful, non-violent movement. It was pretty nasty. It was quite intolerant in times. It was quite violent at times. But that doesn't detract from the kind of movement that we were involved with. And I just thought I'll put up this last slide here just to show you the principles that were talked about yesterday of successful nonviolent action. So unity, yes, massive unity, but there was intolerance of those who weren't part of our broad vision. Planning, well, there was some planning, but there was also a high level of defensiveness, of responsiveness, of spontaneity. Discipline, it was quite a disciplined movement, but it wasn't a disciplined nonviolent movement. Anyway, I think I better leave it at that, hey, Bill? Great. Thanks.